An avoidant expects anger when you leave, not calm. They prepare themselves for storms when someone walks away, raised voices, long messages, emotional spirals that confirm they still matter. Chaos feels familiar to them. It gives shape to the ending. It reassures them that you're still emotionally tethered, still reachable, still reacting. What they are not prepared for is silence that arrives without bitterness. A super empath who detaches without protest, without punishment, without trying to be understood one last time. Because that kind of silence doesn't argue. It doesn't accuse. It doesn't ask for reassurance or closure. It simply removes itself. No chasing, no emotional bargaining, no final speech meant to wake them up, just absence that doesn't ask to be fixed. And that's where the fracture begins. Avoidants regulate their nervous system through distance. They step back when emotions rise, assuming the other person will lean forward. They expect space to be theirs to control something they grant, withdraw, or ration. But when you choose distance first, the structure collapses. Because now, distance isn't a tool, it's a consequence. Your calm doesn't signal indifference. It signals completion, and completion terrifies someone who assumed access was permanent. They replay the ending, searching for the fight that never happened, the message they expected but didn't receive, the emotional eruption that would prove you were still inside the dynamic. But there's nothing to respond to. No anger to soothe, no pain to dismiss. No need to explain why they needed space again. Your silence doesn't pressure them, it disorients them. Because super empaths don't detach impulsively. They detach after trying quietly for a long time, after translating needs into softer words, after holding space without being held back. So when they finally stop speaking, it isn't punishment, it's exhaustion turned into clarity. And avoidants don't recognize that shift immediately. They mistake it for temporary calm. They assume you'll circle back once the emotions catch up. But this silence isn't waiting, it isn't pausing, it's closing. That's why it lingers in their body long after you're gone. Not as heartbreak, but as a subtle panic. Because for the first time, they aren't managing the distance. They aren't choosing when connection resumes. They aren't the one holding the door.
You are?
And you didn't slam it. You didn't beg them to notice. You simply walked away with your dignity intact, which leaves them with an unfamiliar question they never expected to face. What happens when the person who loved the hardest stops reaching altogether? And that question has no immediate answer. The moment you stop reacting, their leverage disappears. For a long time, the avoidant sense of control never came from dominance or certainty. It came from predictability. They knew that if they pulled back, you would lean in. If they went quiet, you would try to understand. If they became distant, you would become more emotionally present. That rhythm made them feel safe without ever having to say it out loud. Your reactions were the proof that the connection still existed, even when they refused to nurture it. So when you detach without reaction, something subtle but devastating happens. There is no emotional feedback loop anymore. No reassurance that they can still reach you if they decide to. No evidence that their withdrawal still affects you. The power doesn't get taken from them dramatically. It simply dissolves quietly, almost politely. And that's what makes it unsettling. Avoidants don't crave control in obvious ways. They crave it through emotional asymmetry. As long as you care more, explain more, and wait longer, they feel anchored without having to commit. Your emotional availability became the stabilizer they never acknowledged needing. And when that availability disappears, they don't feel rejected at first. They feel untethered. At first, they assume it's temporary. They tell themselves you're just taking space, that you'll resurface once the emotions settle. Because in their internal world, connection doesn't end, it pauses. They expect access to remain, even if intimacy doesn't. What they don't anticipate is a super empath who doesn't punish, threaten, or dramatize the detachment, but simply stops participating in the dynamic altogether. That's when confusion sets in. They may reach out casually, testing the waters, expecting the old emotional responsiveness, a familiar warmth, a signal that they still matter in the same way. But what they encounter instead is neutrality, politeness, or nothing at all. And neutrality is far more destabilizing than anger because it doesn't invite repair. It doesn't reopen the door. This is the moment their internal hierarchy collapses. Not because you prove strength outwardly, but because you no longer orient yourself around their behavior. You are no longer waiting for clarity. You are no longer trying to be chosen. And that shift removes the invisible leverage they didn't even know they were holding. What hurts most isn't that you left, it's that your emotional world no longer revolves around their presence or absence. They can't feel where they stand anymore. They can't locate themselves in your reactions. And without that reference point, they are forced to sit with something they've avoided for years, their own emotional emptiness. Your detachment doesn't teach them a lesson. It doesn't correct them. It simply reveals a truth they never expected to confront, that their sense of safety was borrowed, not built. And once it's gone, there is no dramatic moment where they regain it. There is only the quiet realization that the person who once made it easy to feel powerful no longer needs to. Avoidants don't process loss in real time. They process it in echo. While you were still inside the relationship, you were already grieving. You felt the distance long before it was named. You noticed the emotional gaps, the unfinished conversations, the moments where connection almost happened but didn't. As a super empath, your nervous system registered the loss early. You didn't wait for the ending to feel the pain. You lived it quietly, day after day, while still trying to hold the bond together. The avoidant, on the other hand, was surviving by not feeling. Emotional suppression wasn't a choice, it was a reflex. When intimacy deepened, they distracted themselves. When conflict appeared, they minimized it. When your needs surfaced, they interpreted them as pressure rather than information. In their mind, the relationship hadn't ended because it never fully landed emotionally in the first place. That's why the breakup or your detachment doesn't hit them immediately. At first, they feel relief. Space calms their nervous system. Silence feels like regulation. They convince themselves that this distance is healthy, even necessary. And because they don't feel the loss right away, they assume it means they never cared as deeply as you did. But loss doesn't disappear when it's avoided, it delays. Weeks later, sometimes months, the echo arrives. Not as longing or obvious heartbreak, but as a strange internal imbalance. The routines feel off. The emotional world feels flatter. Connections that once distracted them start to feel hollow. And slowly, without a clear trigger, your absence becomes noticeable. This is when confusion replaces relief. They don't miss you in the way you missed them. They miss you in fragments, in moments where emotional translation is required and no one steps in situations where vulnerability is expected, and they freeze in the quiet realization that something essential is missing, but they don't know how to name it. By the time they feel it, you are already somewhere else internally. You've processed the grief, you've faced the disappointment, you've mourned the version of them you hoped would show up. Your detachment wasn't sudden. It was the final stage of a long emotional exit. And because you allowed yourself to feel everything early, there's nothing left unresolved inside you. That's what creates the emotional time gap. They are just beginning to feel disoriented while you are stabilizing. They are questioning the loss while you have already integrated it. And when they finally look back with clarity, they are often shocked by how much weight you carried alone. This delayed awareness is painful because it offers no relief. They can't go back to fix what they didn't recognize at the time. They can't re-enter a dynamic that no longer exists. And they can't rush their own emotional process to catch up with yours. So they sit in the echo, feeling something they don't fully understand, missing someone who no longer feels the same absence, and realizing too late that what you gave wasn't just love, it was emotional timing they failed to meet. You weren't just a partner, you were emotional infrastructure. When you were in their life, you did more than love them. You stabilized them in ways they never consciously acknowledged. You softened emotional edges before they became problems. You anticipated moods, translated silence, and adjusted your tone to keep the connection from fracturing. As a super empath, you didn't do this for credit. You did it instinctively. It felt natural to hold the emotional weight so the relationship could function. But what avoidants rarely admit, even to themselves, is how much of their emotional identity is outsourced. They rely on proximity to someone emotionally attuned to feel regulated without having to be vulnerable. Your presence gave them a sense of coherence. With you there, they didn't have to fully understand their own feelings because you were quietly doing that work in the background. So when you detach, the loss isn't immediately romantic. It's structural. At first, they notice small disruptions. Conversations feel harder. Emotional moments feel clumsy. They struggle to articulate what they want or need, even in low stakes interactions. They feel misunderstood more often, but can't explain why. What they're experiencing isn't missing you as a person yet. It's missing the internal stability your presence provided. This is the part they don't talk about because it threatens their self-image. Avoidants often see themselves as independent, self-contained, and emotionally self-sufficient. Admitting that someone else served as emotional infrastructure contradicts that narrative. So instead of naming the loss, they minimize it. They tell themselves they're just tired, distracted, out of sync. But the emptiness persists. Without you, they are forced to confront emotional tasks they never had to complete alone, regulating discomfort, sitting with uncertainty, expressing needs without fear of exposure. And because these skills were never fully developed, every interaction feels heavier, more effortful, less fluid. That's when frustration turns inward. They may feel irritable, restless, or oddly detached from people who once felt easy to be around. They may chase stimulation, distraction, or surface level connections, hoping to recreate the feeling of balance you provided. But it doesn't work. Because what they lost wasn't chemistry, it was emotional translation. And the most destabilizing part is this: they can't replace that function easily. Emotional attunement isn't something you download into another person. It's built through presence, patience, and deep familiarity, the kind you offered without being asked. So the identity loss sets in quietly. They don't think, I lost someone who loved me deeply. They think, something feels off about me lately. They don't realize that the part of themselves that felt calm, grounded, and understood was activated in your presence. Your detachment didn't just remove a relationship, it removed a system they depended on without knowing it. And once that system is gone, they are left alone with an emotional architecture that was never designed to stand on its own. They don't feel abandoned by your absence, they feel replaced by your peace. When you detach and begin to heal, it doesn't register as growth to them. It registers as a rupture, not because you left, but because you didn't break. In their internal logic, separation is supposed to create longing, chaos, or visible pain. Your calm disrupts that expectation. It tells a story they never prepared for, that the relationship wasn't your emotional center, it was your emotional drain. Avoidants are comfortable with distance as long as it confirms their narrative, that you needed more, that you were too emotional, that the separation was inevitable because closeness overwhelmed them. But your healing challenges that entire framework. If you are okay without them, then the problem wasn't intimacy itself. It was their inability to meet it. And that realization feels like betrayal. Not because you did something wrong, but because your peace removes their protective story. They can no longer frame themselves as the one who escaped something too intense. Your stability suggests that love wasn't dangerous, avoidance was, and that implication is deeply uncomfortable. They expected you to miss them loudly, to reach out, to need reassurance. Your quiet recovery feels like replacement, as if you swapped them out for a better emotional life. And in a way, you did, but not with another person. You replace the chaos with self-respect. This is where resentment can surface. They may interpret your healing as coldness, as emotional detachment that proves they never mattered. They might tell themselves you moved on too quickly, ignoring the fact that you processed the grief long before you left. They don't see the nights you spent trying to understand, the emotional labor you carried alone. They only see the result, and it unsettles them because your healing suggests that their presence was optional. And avoidants struggle with that idea more than with loss itself. Being missed feels manageable. Being unnecessary feels threatening. It forces them to confront a painful truth. You weren't held by the relationship. You were held back by it. As you stabilize, your energy changes. You're less reactive, less available for emotional ambiguity, less willing to translate silence into meaning. That shift creates an invisible boundary they can't cross, even if they wanted to. Your healing is not an invitation. It's a signal that the old dynamic no longer exists. To them, it feels like a door closing without a conversation. But what they don't understand is that healing isn't a message to them. It's a return to yourself. You didn't heal to prove anything. You healed because staying emotionally suspended was no longer survivable. And that's the final sting. Your peace doesn't attack them. It doesn't accuse them. It simply stands there, calm, grounded, unreachable, quietly revealing that the connection they assumed would always be available is no longer part of your life. That's why your healing feels like betrayal. Not because you left them behind, but because you didn't take their unfinished emotional work with you. Avoidants don't regret losing you. They regret realizing you won't come back. For a long time, they assumed distance was reversible. That connection could be paused and resumed at will. Avoidants are used to relationships existing in a kind of emotional limbo, close enough to feel secure, distant enough to avoid vulnerability. They rarely imagine an ending that is final, because finality requires emotional acknowledgement, and that's something they postpone. So when you detach, they don't panic immediately. They tell themselves there's time, that if they ever feel ready, you'll still be there in some form. This belief allows them to avoid urgency. It keeps regret dormant. It reassures them that nothing truly irreversible has happened yet, until one day that assumption collapses. It doesn't happen dramatically. There's no single moment of realization. It arrives quietly in pieces, a message you don't respond to, a boundary you don't explain, a shift in your energy that makes it clear, not cruelly but unmistakably, that access is gone. This is when regret finally surfaces. Not as heartbreak, but as a sinking recognition that the window closed while they were still deciding whether to look out of it. They don't just miss you. They miss the version of themselves they were when you made emotional life easier. And that's the part they can't recover. What makes this regret unbearable is that it has no outlet. They can't fix it with an apology because the dynamic that required apology no longer exists. They can't renegotiate the relationship because you're not negotiating anymore. Your detachment wasn't a tactic, it was a conclusion. Avoidants often imagine that if regret comes, it will motivate reconnection. That longing will create action. But this kind of regret doesn't lead outward. It turns inward. It becomes self-directed discomfort. They don't know how to soothe. They replay moments where they minimized your needs, times they chose distance over repair, conversations they avoided because they felt overwhelming at the time. And for the first time, they understand the cost, not intellectually, but emotionally. Yet understanding arrives without permission to act. That's the cruelty of delayed recognition. It offers clarity without opportunity. They see you clearly when they no longer have access to you. They value what you offered when there is no path back to it. And unlike earlier phases, there's no one to blame. You didn't leave impulsively. You didn't threaten. You didn't punish. You stayed until staying meant losing yourself. So the regret lingers without resolution. It doesn't explode. It doesn't disappear. It lives quietly in the knowledge that you didn't leave to teach them a lesson. You left because you already learned yours. And that's the pain they never expected. Not losing you in the moment, but realizing too late that you were never coming back. When they lose access, they rewrite your importance. While you were present, they saw you through the lens of comfort and convenience. Your availability made your value feel stable, almost guaranteed. Because you stayed, because you tried, because you adapted, they assumed you would always exist in the background of their life. Emotionally accessible, quietly patient, endlessly understanding. Familiarity dulled the perception of rarity. But once you detach, memory changes. Distance does something avoidance don't anticipate. It removes emotional anesthesia. Without the pressure of intimacy, without the fear of being needed, their nervous system finally slows enough to feel. And in that space, they begin to remember you not as someone who asked for too much, but as someone who gave more than anyone else ever has. Suddenly, moments resurface with new weight. Your patience no longer looks excessive. It looks intentional. Your sensitivity no longer feels overwhelming. It feels attuned. The things they once minimized become the very qualities they can't find elsewhere. But this recognition only comes when there's no longer a demand to respond to it. This is why avoidants often idealize partners after they're gone. While you were there, loving you required vulnerability. It required presence. It required effort. They weren't ready to give. But remembering you from a distance requires none of that. They can romanticize without risking exposure. They can appreciate without committing. They can feel without being seen. With so, the story shifts. You become the one who understood them. the safest connection they ever had, the person who loved them without conditions. Not because you changed, but because the cost of acknowledging your value is now emotional, not relational. There is no longer any expectation that they will act on the realization, and that makes it feel safer to finally tell the truth. But this reframe carries a quiet pain. Because even as they elevate your memory, they remain locked out of your present. They may think about reaching out, about testing whether the door is still open. But something in your detachment communicates finality, not hostility, certainty. And certainty leaves no room for ambiguity. What they don't say out loud is that remembering you differently also means remembering themselves differently. They begin to see the version of themselves who avoided, delayed, and withdrew. And that contrast creates discomfort because the person they lost wasn't replaceable and the person they were with you isn't easily recreated. So you live on in their mind as a reference point, a quiet comparison, the connection against which others are measured and often found lacking. Not because you were perfect, but because you were present in a way they didn't know how to sustain. And this is the final irony. They understand you best when you are no longer there to benefit from it. They appreciate you fully when appreciation requires nothing from them. And you remain significant in their memory, not as someone they lost in conflict, but as someone they lost because they couldn't meet the moment when it mattered. By the time they remember you clearly, you are already out of reach, not hidden, not distant, simply living in a chapter they can revisit, but never re-enter. The deepest pain isn't missing you, it's realizing you no longer need them. This is the part no one prepares them for. They expect longing. They expect nostalgia. They expect the dull ache of missing someone who mattered. What they never anticipate is the moment they realize they are no longer relevant to your emotional world, not resented, not avoided, just unnecessary. For avoidance, being needed has always felt safer than being known. As long as you needed them, they had a role without having to fully show up. Your reliance gave them position. It allowed them to stay partially engaged while still feeling important. So when that need disappears, something fundamental collapses. They notice it in subtle ways first. You don't seek validation. You don't look to them for reassurance. Your tone has changed, grounded, self-contained, no emotional pull. Even if you cross paths, there is no charge, no unfinished energy. And that neutrality lands harder than rejection ever could. Because rejection still confirms relevance. Indifference does not. The realization settles slowly. You are no longer orienting your emotional decisions around them. Their opinions don't carry weight. Their presence doesn't shift your nervous system. You are not waiting to be chosen, explained to, or understood by them. And for someone who unconsciously relied on being emotionally central without being emotionally present, this is devastating. They can't fix it with effort because effort now comes too late. They can't provoke a reaction because you are no longer reactive. They can't reclaim importance because importance was never taken from them. It simply expired. What hurts most is that your detachment doesn't look dramatic. It looks healthy. And health leaves no opening for guilt, apology, or rescue fantasies. You didn't fall apart. You didn't harden. You integrate. This forces them to confront a truth they avoided for years. Connection requires participation. And by the time they understand that, you have already moved into a life where participation from them is no longer required. They may tell themselves stories to soften the blow, that you were never that invested, that the connection wasn't that deep, that they're better off this way. But those narratives don't hold in quiet moments. Because deep down, they feel the absence not as loss, but as displacement. You didn't just leave the relationship, you left the role they assigned you. And there is no replacement for that. The final pain isn't that you found someone else. It's that you found yourself. You no longer reach for them in moments of uncertainty. You no longer measure your worth through their availability. You no longer wait for emotional permission. And that is the ending they never expected. Not because you disappeared, but because you stayed whole without them. That realization doesn't break them loudly. It sits with them quietly as an understanding they carry forward. They didn't lose someone who needed them. They lost someone who chose themselves and meant it.